Hello, Dungeon Destroyers. Welcome to Gamertopia. Today we're going to be going over a new sorcerer build for Abattoir of Zir. I've been calling this my room for error build because it's allowed me to clear past tier 15, but the build is pretty tanky and allows for mistakes to be made without immediately dying. Before we start going over the build, if you end up using this build or if you're looking for more Diablo content, do me a favor and subscribe to my channel. It helps me out a ton and will keep you up to date with all my future videos. Alright, let's get on with the build. We're going to start with 2 ranks of Firebolt, and we will be using this as our first enchantment. This gives all of our skills a burning effect, which will give us a large amount of additional damage through Talrosh's loop. Next, we'll go down to our core skill tree and we'll take 1 rank of Devastation, which will allow us to max out our elemental dominance. This gives us a 9% increased damage from our core and mastery skills when cast above 50% mana. Now we'll move down to the defensive skill tree and we'll take 1 rank of Flame Shield, which is great for Abattoir of Zir since it gives us immunity and it will also be giving us a barrier. We'll also take 1 rank of Teleport with Enhanced Teleport and Shimmering Teleport. We'll be using Teleport more than any other skill in this build, so the reduced cooldown is great and the extra damage reduction is a must for Abattoir of Zir. We'll also take 1 rank of the Elemental Attunement passive to give us a 5% chance to reset one of our 3 defensive skills. Next, we'll go down to the Conjuration tree and take 1 rank of Ice Blades with Enhanced Ice Blades and Summoned Ice Blades. This skill is essential for the build to work. Enhanced Ice Blade is going to reduce the cooldown of your next Ice Blades cast, and Summoned Ice Blade is going to take 20% of that reduction and apply it to all of your other cooldowns. You can get to the point where you're able to spam any of your abilities and burn down any enemies in your path. We're also going to be using Ice Blades as our second enchantment to give us a free automatic cast of Ice Blades every time we use 40 seconds of cooldowns. This is going to further our cooldown reduction even more than it already is. Next, we'll take 1 rank of Align the Elements so we can max out Mana Shield and Protection. These passives give you damage reduction and a barrier whenever we use a cooldown. As you can imagine, with Ice Blades and Protection, you'll start to have a barrier up constantly since our cooldowns will be available almost all of the time. We'll also take 3 ranks of Conjuration Mastery to give us a 3% increase to damage for each conjuration that we have active. A single point will be put into Precision Magic as well to give us a 5% lucky hit chance boost. Now for the Mastery tree, we'll be maxing out Ball Lightning and use Enhanced and Wizard Ball Lightning. This is going to increase the damage of our Ball Lightning skill and also make it drop tons of crackling energy, which will mean increased damage and increased mana. For passives, we'll be using 3 ranks of Icy Veil, which increases our barrier durations by 15%. We'll use 1 rank of Inner Flames to allow us to max out Devouring Blaze for an increased critical strike damage to all of our enemies. We'll also take 1 rank of Static Discharge for a 5% chance for our Shock Skill critical strikes to drop a crackling energy, and 3 ranks of Invigorating Conduit to allow our crackling energy to give us 12 mana for each one we pick up. In our ultimate skill tree, we'll be using Unstable Currents and Prime Unstable Currents. This will increase our damage output with extra skills being cast, and it will also increase our attack speed. Then from here, all we have left are some passives. We'll take 1 rank of Permafrost and Hoarfrost to open up Frigid Breeze, which we will max out. This will give us a 20% chance for cold damage done against vulnerable enemies to generate 15 mana. Since our Ice Blades are causing enemies to become vulnerable, this will help with our resource management. Next, we'll take 3 ranks of Fiery Surge to give us a 45% increased mana regeneration whenever we kill a burning enemy. Our Firebolt enchantment is going to cause all of our enemies to be burning, so this will be an almost constant effect. We'll also take 1 rank of Coursing Currents to open up Electrocution, which we'll put 3 ranks into. This makes enemies who are critically hit by a shock skill do 15% less damage for 5 seconds. Lastly, for our key passive, we'll be using Overflowing Energy to increase our cooldowns even further, and we'll also be using Veer's Mastery. I'll get back to that in a moment. Now for our vampiric powers, we'll be using Ravenous for the lucky hit chance to increase our attack speed, Domination for the increased damage to stun enemies, Accursed Touch to cause Vampiric Curse, Prey on the Weak to cause enemies affected by the Vampiric Curse to be vulnerable, and then to increase our vulnerable damage by 16%. And lastly, Feed the Coven, which gives us a 60% lucky hit chance to increase our damage by 10% when we cast our Ice Blades and also restore 10 mana. Moving on to the gear, you'll want to use Harlequin Crest for this, but it's the only uber unique you'll need for the build. For the chest, we'll use Raiment of the Infinite, and I would prioritize the damage to close and stun enemy stats rolls over the stun effect roll. For gloves, we'll be using Aspect of Elements for up to a 30% increased lightning damage every 7 seconds, but this is actually going to be 60%, which I'll also get back to in a moment. The stats on this glove should be attack speed, crit chance against against injured, and lucky hit chance. On the pants, we'll be using Ever Living aspect for up to 25% damage reduction from vulnerable enemies, and we'll use total armor percentage, damage reduction from close enemies, damage reduction while injured, and 4 ranks of ball lightning. The boots have Exploiters aspect on them to increase our stun duration from teleport via Raiment of the Infinite by 20%, and you'll want movement speed, damage reduction while injured, mana cost reduction, and 4 ranks of fire shield. For the weapon, you'll want to use a dagger because it gives you the 30% increased damage to close enemies, and you'll also want to use aspect of control on it. This gives you a 35% damage increase to stun enemies. You'll also want to have vulnerable damage, mastery skill damage, damage to close enemies, and damage to stunned enemies. For the offhand, we'll use gravitational aspect to increase our ball lightning damage and make them circle around us, and we'll also want to have crit chance, mana cost reduction, resource generation, and cooldown reduction. On our first ring, we'll be using Storm Swell aspect for up to a 30% damage increase to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier, and we'll have a barrier almost always, so this is going to be a constant effect. And we'll also want to have crit chance, damage to close enemies, damage to stunned enemies, and resource generation on the ring. The next ring is going to be Talrash's Loop, which gives us a 15% damage increase for each element we use against an enemy. You'll be getting at least a 45% damage increase from fire, lightning, and cold damage, but there is a way to get the extra 15% from poison damage, which I have not been using, but I'll go over as well. Lastly, for our amulet, we'll be using the Disobedience aspect to give us a huge armor boost, and we'll use total armor percentage, damage reduction while injured, ranks of mastery skills, and ranks of Devouring Blaze. I think you might be better off with swapping damage reduction while injured with cooldown reduction if you can get it, but I've not been lucky enough to get an amulet with that specific stat roll. Since we're not doing this as a specific damage reduction build, it's not totally necessary to have that. It's just kind of a safety net in case you do end up getting injured. I'm not going to go too in depth on the Paragon board, but let me know if you want the full build and I can put one together so you can use the exact one I have. For our starting board, we'll be using the Elementalist glyph. This is going to give us a boost to our damage output and give us a little bit extra resistance to all elements, which we'll also be getting both of these from all 4 rare nodes on this board. For the next board, we'll be using the Burning Instinct board, and we'll be using the Control glyph, which will increase the damage to our stunned enemies. Then we'll attach the Enchantment Master board on the left and use the Reinforced glyph to further increase our damage and resistances. Then at the top, we'll be attaching the Frigid Fate board with the Adept glyph to increase the damage of our ball lightning. We'll also be using the Frigid Fate legendary node on this board, which gives us some bonus damage to vulnerable enemies. On the right, we'll attach the Elemental Summoner board and use the Flame Feeder glyph, which increases our damage to burning enemies. Since the Firebolt enchantment causes enemies to burn anytime we attack them with a skill, this will be a damage increase to all enemies. Then at the top, we'll attach the Ceaseless Conduit board and use the Destruction glyph for an increase to our critical strike damage. And then finally, the last board will be attached to the left. This is going to be the Static Surge board, and we'll be using our Tears of Blood glyph here. Now, for this build to work properly, you will need 2 more pieces of equipment. You're going to need a random staff and amulet. The stats don't matter because you'll only be using the aspects on these. You'll want a max roll of Aspect of Elements on a staff and a max roll of Mage Lord's aspect on a amulet. What we'll be doing with these is commonly known as snapshotting. In case you don't know what this is, I'll go over it briefly. Snapshotting is something that's always been in place in the game, but has never been needed to be taken advantage of until Abattoir of Zir. What it is most basically is the game saves all of your skills and equipment whenever you enter a dungeon instance, but you can also swap out some skills and equipment and end up getting extra effects. So basically, before I enter a dungeon, I equip the staff with the 60% aspect of elements and the amulet with the 13.5% damage reduction. As soon as I enter the dungeon, the game saves that those and all my other equipment and skills are what I'm using for that dungeon. Then I go into my abilities and change Overflowing Energy to Vir's Mastery to allow the Mage Lord's aspect to begin to work, and then we just swap it back to Overflowing Energy to keep that as my main key passive. Then I can equip my main dagger, offhand, and amulet and start the dungeon. For the aspect of elements to work properly, you do have to have it on another piece of equipment, but since the Vir's Mastery is working off of a key passive, that one works without having it on another piece of equipment. Now, as far as how to play this build, you'll start by casting Ice Armor and Ice Ice Blaze, then teleporting into groups of enemies to stun them, and then we'll start burning them down with Ball Lightning. Cast Unstable Currents and Ice Blades as often as possible. As soon as the cooldown for them is up, you can go ahead and cast them. You come up to your next group of enemies quickly in Abattoirs of Zir, so you can just keep them active. Your Ice Blades are keeping your cooldown short, and Overwhelming Currents is going to increase your attack speed and create a ton of crackling energy, which keeps your mana high. You'll also get a free Ice Blades cast every time you cast Overwhelming Currents, since the cooldown for it is over 40 seconds. Keep Flame Shield available as often as possible for any time you find yourself in a situation where your other cooldowns are unavailable, or you're about to not have a barrier active. Also use this if you're about to be CC'd, or if you're about to be hit with a hard-hitting attack. Last thing I'll say is if you want to try giving yourself some extra damage, you can swap out one of your vampiric powers for Infection. While you're actively damaging an enemy, you can swap back to your original vampiric power and keep the extra stack of damage, but if you let this go for too long without attacking someone, you'll lose that buff. What I would do in this scenario is just purposefully not kill all of the enemies in the group and leave one of my Ice Blades up to attack them while I'm moving on to my next group, and that way you can keep it active throughout the whole dungeon. The one thing that this doesn't work well with is once you get to the bosses, there's too much of a gap in between the time that they spawn, and it ends up falling off as a buff, so you would have to redo this at the start of the boss fight, and I find that I personally have been dying way too often while I'm trying to swap them out to use this consistently. Hope this helps you in the Abattoir of Zir. Let me know in the comments if you'll be using this build. Also, let me know what you're looking forward to for Season 3.